Lubbock and Plainview, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
All right, very good. Thank you, Ms. Betts, for sending me the info about Eddie Dixon. I want to talk about him today.
Well, you're more than welcome. I saw that. I said, oh, Sharon is good stuff.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's wonderful that you know him.
He's a character.
All right, we're going to get started here. Hope everyone's doing well. Everything going well back there? Okay, y'all with me? I do want to say this real quick. There is no test this week. It is a week from today. So we're going to focus on finishing up sculpture, then launch right into architecture question, and then finish with the crafts and graphic design Thursday in here, and then I'll give out the study guide, my notes, and hopefully you'll be in class to get those. I've had some issues in posting things, so be present. And I've had a few people that have missed more than one test when it was given on the date. I know professors that will not give a test late. Students have to be present at that date or they miss it. It's a zero. I'm not going to be like that, but try to be here, especially if you miss one or more test days. Try to be here for that day, please, next Tuesday, and take that test. And it just saves me from having to track down everyone and give the test again, and so on. So, just a heads up on that. I want to pick up where we left off. I do want to tell you, though, we finished the mosaic last night, and yay, and thank you, yes. Appreciate that very much. And so if you've not seen it, you can go by and see it. At night, they've got a light on it that we talked yesterday about them adjusting the light out, so they're getting with their electrician to do that. But right now, the light just shines straight down on it, and so it's oblique lighting, and it's not the best. So they need to bump it out a few inches and have it shine directly on it coming in. And so, those of you in Plainview or Lubbock, field trip, right? Anyway, I hope you get to come and see it, or if you're here in town, you have an opportunity to drive by. But don't do too much rubbernecking if you're on College Avenue, because the traffic on there is crazy, right? People drive crazy and they're not so aware about other drivers. They're just trying to impress someone else or just trying to get where they're going. But pull in there, they never mind. They said, we love having people come see it. So pull in and get out and look at it, because you can see some details that you can't see. I may show some other pictures later. They're going to have an event sometime in the next week or so. I'll let you know about that too. Anyway, it feels good after working for, we really started on this project a year ago. Design, discussion, planning, and then actually worked beginning probably in March finalizing the design, getting the patterns drawn, ordering the tile, and preparing all of that. We've worked for almost 2 months mounting it. And so someone said, well, you feel like you've just delivered a baby. I said, well, I don't know about that, but we did spend a lot of time and months on something. So it wasn't every day, but we worked long and hard hours, and I feel a little more fit than I did before. I got through it. We both got through it at our age. It's pretty amazing. We're blessed to be able to do it. So hope you get to see it, and I may try to show you some other pictures later, some slides of that. So it's best in person, though, right? Always to see art in person. It's the best thing. So anyway, let's go to monuments now, because we're talking about public art, and that's what the mosaics are. That's what art all around Tech campus and in other places in Lubbock is, in Plainview on the Wayland campus, the fiberglass cows, the Longhorns that are all around town. That's public art. But let's talk about a specific kind of art. Veterans Day, right? We need to think about veterans and honoring veterans always, and those men and women who have helped preserve freedom. But let's go to monuments now and talk about this idea. Make sure you have this in your notes, because a monument is made for a specific site. So it's what we call site specific. It is a public work of art. Hold on. Thank you. It should be. How about that? Okay? All right. And then I'm going to do another little switcheroo here. There we go. Okay, so y'all can see me and hear me and that. So a monument is made for a particular place, so it's site specific. It is public art. Everyone can see it and enjoy it. But here's the important part. It's made to preserve the memory of a person or an event. It's a monument to someone, or it's a monument to a happening, an event, something that we need to never forget. And so that's a pretty wide category, and you see these things all the time. We were talking about the historical marker in the metropolis of Gale, Texas, a while ago. And that's sort of a monument in a way to the history of the people there in this great little town, Borden County. But a monument, in this way, we're talking about artwork. So some of you have been here. If you've not been here, I recommend that you go. Just a day's drive from here. Oklahoma City National Memorial. How many of you have been there? No one besides me? Why is Oklahoma City making this memorial? Yes. This guy named Tim McVeigh was mad about the Waco tragedy where these people were killed. Come on in. And so he decided that he and some of his buddies figured out that they could make a truck bomb, and they filled it with fertilizer, which is nitrates are part of explosives, and set a crude but very effective device in this rented truck and parked it outside the Murrah Federal Building there in downtown Oklahoma City. And he took off, and he was caught, thankfully, and he's been executed for his crime. But all these people, each of these chairs represents one of the victims there. And it's sad all the way around. But the truly sad, tragic thing about it, that he set that bomb off right in front of where the daycare center was for all those federal workers there. So many children were killed. So if you go there, you'll see each of these chairs. Some are small chairs signifying the life of a child who died in that tragedy, needless, senseless. But you'll see the reflecting pool there, and then you'll see a gate at either end. It has the time of the beginning of the explosion and the end. So each of those times are marked there. And what I don't have in these slides, around the outside, they put a chain link fence up while they did the investigation and the recovery of bodies and all this. It took months to do that. My wife's cousin, her husband was an Oklahoma City police officer at the time this happened, and he said it was just it was a nightmare. It was one of the worst things that he could ever imagine happening, and there he was right in the middle of it. But they put this chain link fence up, and people started leaving notes on that chain link fence, and then they started leaving toys that were, some were the real toys of the children who had died there, and some were just toys that people brought in honor of those children. So they preserved that chain link fence there. And some of the things are in tatters, but some people replaced things there. So we should never forget this awful thing. That violence is never a solution to someone's imagined issues, and these people were totally defenseless and totally without any connection to this, except it was part of the federal government. This guy thought this is the thing to do. And you see this glass and then the cast bronze chairs that are kind of symbolic there. There's more than one Holocaust memorial. I have people that say, I've heard people say this, and you see it on different news pages and on the internet, you read all kinds of crazy things, that the Holocaust never happened. I've been to Dachau, one of the concentration camps in Germany. I've known survivors from those concentration camps. There was a lady who lived in Lubbock, and y'all may have been to the Pancake House on Avenue Q. And the family that started that, J.B. Hans and his wife Eva, were friends of my wife's parents. And so I got to know them. And one day I was talking to Eva, and I looked at her arm, and she had a tattoo on her arm. And so we didn't interrupt the conversation, and I asked my wife later about it, and she said, I think she was in one of the concentration camps, and she was. She was a survivor. And I'll try to show you a little clip of her later on. I think she's maybe still living, or she died recently, but she was in her 90s the last time I checked. She moved to Arizona, so we hadn't seen her in years. But she talked to Lubbock school children, and she's on the internet. Her testimony about what really happened in those concentration camps. So these memorials like this, sometimes they're very simple, sometimes they're always symbolic, but they're monuments to an event that should have never happened. Millions of Jews, just for their faith, and the Nazis and what they did to them. We've looked at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial before. Maya Lin, we'll talk about her a little later today, designed this. Very poignant, very simple, but very meaningful monument. And you can see a flag down there, and I'm not sure people are touching these names. If you have been, how many of you have been here? Some of you have been here? Put it on your list, right? And if you're standing and looking, this is the Washington Mall, there's the Washington Monument down there, you see Congress. At your back is the Lincoln Memorial, with this huge statue of Abraham Lincoln. And then you swivel to the right just a little bit, and you see this statue, because they got to talking about it, they said, this is one war. Now, women have always taken care of men in wars. There have always been women who nursed others back to health and so on. But especially in the Vietnam Women's Memorial, they were right there. They were at Korea. You watch MASH. They were in units that took care of these men that were in battle. But the women were especially important. They said, we need to have this monument. So Lubbock's own Glenna Goodacre, right? You've been on Glenna Goodacre Drive or seen that. She was from Lubbock, and she was commissioned to do the sculpture showing these women caring for the wounded there. So that's just to the right of the Vietnam Memorial. Down the mall is this one, which is especially meaningful to me because my dad was in Korea when I was born. He was an infantryman in the Army, and we were looking at these. We went on a tour, and then we got back later and got to walk through this. There's a little chain there, but these are men like going through on patrol, and they're a little larger than life size. One of the men, I swear, looked like my dad. It just got me. So I told my sisters and my mom and dad about it when we got back, and so one of my sisters was able to take my dad back there. You see how they do memorials now where they can photo etch the images on granite? If you've been to the Gold Star Memorial in Lubbock, that's a pretty amazing memorial. They're very realistic photographs of the men and women that were there in Korea, and here's a picture of my dad when he was. That's not him, no, in the picture, but that's him visiting that, and I was so glad that he got to go, and it really meant a lot to him. And my dad never talked about his experiences in the war until a year or so before he passed away, but it was he still had nightmares about it all of his life after he came back. And war does something, but war is sadly necessary to preserve freedom. Here's Friedrich St. Florian's World War II Memorial. The only time I've been in Washington, D.C., this was under construction. I'd love to go back sometime and see it because this memorial means so much. Don't ever forget that these men and women that fought in this war saved the world. That's not an overstatement. They saved the world, and here's each of the states and a bronze wreath there. And then those gold stars. Now, if you don't know what a gold star means, it's people get a gold star plaque, and they used to give gold star flags and so on in World War I, but they're symbolic of someone who's lost a family member. So you have these gold star families still. But each one of those 4,048 gold stars represents 100 Americans who died in World War II to preserve freedom. That means that's 40,480 Americans died. That's wild, isn't it? But thank goodness for their willingness to serve and sacrifice. This Lubbock Area Veterans War Memorial is there off 82nd Street in Lubbock. And I'm sorry, I need to update this because I have some good pictures of the Gold Star Memorial that's just down from that. My wife and I and our families got a brick that's in size with both of our dad's names that's at this memorial. Now, kind of skipping around in the text, and your text doesn't focus on these things, so I wanted to make sure about this. We talked about construction and these kind of things. You see all sorts of crazy things. This is actually a shark. It's supposed to be preserved in formaldehyde. That's kind of creepy to me. So you see artists doing all sorts of things. And this, Betty Saar is an African-American artist, a black artist, who talked about the liberation of Aunt Jemima. So she's taking Aunt Jemima, who started out as a real lady who represented this company, and now that what they've gotten rid of Aunt Jemima, right, as a symbol for the company, because they see it as exploitation. So she's kind of talking about this with this art. We've already talked about kinetic sculpture. This is sculpture that moves, actual moves. We've seen this in the National Gallery, and other things that are balanced in such a way that they move. There's sculpture in a park near Covenant Hospital, near the lake there, that actually moves, and things that are mechanical. So you have some of these in your text, and some that are, they have all kinds of effects with the air and water and lights and so on. Doris Salcedo did this installation at the Tate Modern Museum, and this gap in the floor is supposed to show the difference between cultures and so on. So just showing some of those real quick, but I want to go away from that for just a moment and talk about this young man from Lubbock, Eddie Dixon. This is his site. You can go to it. And that's Eddie with one of his sculptures. And if you've been down 19th Street in Lubbock and 19th Street in University, the corner, you can find a way to park. Don't park on 19th or University, but you can find a place to park nearby and walk over and see this. But there's Eddie and some of his sculptures that he's working on, the clay models, some of the different ones that he's done. He's sought after. He's so busy all the time. Miss Betts sent me there in Lubbock, who's the facilitator, sent me an email the other day and asked if I knew Eddie Dixon's work, and she knows Eddie. I met him years ago when he was just starting out, but he's done, here's Colin Powell, who just passed away from COVID. This is, I think, Dr. Wayland, that Wayland is named after, where my cursor is here. That's the model that was then done for the cast bronze, and you see that bronze. If you've been on the Wayland campus there, it's right in front of the administration building. Here's the Buffalo Soldier monument that he did, and some other old soldiers. There, not far from the monument I just showed you, is the Willie McCool sculpture. If y'all been to that, he's the guy that graduated from Coronado High School, who died in the Columbia Space Shuttle. And there's another picture of Eddie. He's a pretty amazing guy, and some of his sculptures. But this is the one of Tim Cole, and I don't know why it does that. Well, you should be able to get a larger image of that. Tim Cole is the sculpture that honors Tim Cole. Tim Cole's story is a very sad one. He was wrongly identified as an attacker and rapist on the Tech campus, and before DNA was available, later it was proven that he was not the guy who was identified in the lineup. Wrongly convicted, sent to prison, had bad asthma. He died there in prison. But they tried to make things right with his family, but still, he was a member of their family that was wrongly accused, imprisoned, and put to death. I mean, basically, he died in prison. But they did this sculpture memorial there, right across from Tech, honoring Tim Cole. And there's Eddie working on that. You can see the scale of it, how large it is. Anyway, you can browse through this site. It's pretty amazing what Eddie's accomplished, and I'm just amazed at what he does. He's working all the time and creating amazing things. Now, I'm skipping around in your book just a little bit, but we're going to come back to craft media and graphic design. But if you'll go to chapter 12, which is on page 299 in your text, that's where we're going to go. And if this really will play, and I pray it does. Okay, good. That's all good signs. So we're going to talk about architecture and chapter 12. And it starts out with this look at the Pantheon. Now, pan means many in the ancient Greek and the Roman, and theos goes to spiritual things, to God. And so this was this amazing building that was built 15 stories high. I'm not sure how tall the highest building in Lubbock is. This is pretty amazing that the Romans did this in about the 1st century or so. Hadrian, the emperor, was very powerful, and he had all these lofty ideas, and they built one of the largest domes ever built, one of the largest freestanding domes. If you walk up the street from the Colosseum, you get to the Pantheon there in Rome, and it was to honor many gods, and they had these niches inside. Your text shows you a cutaway, the columns in front, leads you into this huge domed area, and it has this opening in the roof, this dome, they call it oculus, which lets light shine down, 150 feet across, 150 feet high, that's 15 stories, 10 feet to a story. And this amazing dome is made of concrete, stone and concrete. One of the first uses is concrete. The Egyptians didn't use concrete, the Romans invented it. We'll talk about that more later because we're talking about architecture. But the dome allows the massive weight to be distributed outward and downward, but they use a special kind of concrete in this, and your text talks about it a little bit, but it mentions that they added a different kind of sand and volcanic material. Let me go back to this just for a moment. But they also used tiny little ceramic vessels. They've made these little jars out of pottery and fired them, and they mixed that into the concrete. So it had body to it, and it would connect to the concrete, but it'd also be light. And so they used volcanic stone in there, which tufa, which made it, it's porous, it made it strong, but it also made it light. So this is still one of the wonders of the architectural world and man-made structure. Make sure you have this word down, facade. I had a friend in college who was in architecture, and he would always pronounce it architecture. And I would say, okay, so John, what are you doing? We were the two Johns for a while there. And we became good friends. He was the best man at my wedding. He said, I'm designing a fake A for a building. You say that word, yes ma'am. You just write the word facade. I'm just telling you where this is. Facade means, it comes from the same base word for a face comes from. So the facade of a building is the face of the building. It's what you see when you walk up to it. So here's St. Peter's Basilica. We'll talk about that later on. But it's the Vatican, right? St. Peter's Basilica. Every building has a facade. You walk over across the street here and look at the new science building. Architecturally, I don't think the facade is all that interesting, but it's a different type of architecture. Appeals to some people and not to others. So the building, the side of the building that you see when you walk up to it, that's the facade. So that's a word I want you to know. Your text talks about some things I won't have in the test, but this idea of form following function is important. We'll talk about Louis Sullivan in a little bit in the Wainwright building, because this is, bless you, this is one of the first skyscrapers. Look at the date this was built. Think about this high-rise buildings built in the 1890s, and of all places in St. Louis. Before there's one built in New York City, because there was a lot of money in St. Louis, because it was the place where they drove cattle to, and they had the meat markets, and they sold meat and beef to markets in the east. So there's a lot of money there, a lot of banks, a lot of financial institutions, and so on. Now here's Frank Gehry, and I'm trying to follow the text pretty well here, page 304. Frank Gehry, this is a picture of him when he was younger. He doesn't quite look like this today, but when he was designing buildings like this in the 90s, early 2000s, his idea was this, that, okay, you have materials that are made to do certain things, but nowadays you have materials that can do anything. And in New York City, and this is the Guggenheim Museum in Spain, but they had a model in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, and it was pieces of plastic and paper and cardboard, thin cardboard, and they were twisted like I'm twisting this piece of paper here in front of you. And Frank Gehry said, if you could do that to paper or plastic, I'll build my model like that, and then we can build a building like that with modern materials. Stainless steel, we can make the structure follow that contour, and so we're going to make the building artistic. And so it'll be like a sculpture. And so that's what he did here. The Disney Center in LA is built like that. There's a center downtown Dallas, pardon? Oh, well, you'll get two. You'll get two. Go to Disneyland and Disney World. So it's a big jump from here, talking about mass and space, and I'm not going to get into all the things that this text talks about, but I want to try to focus on the main things. Because they talk about mass, which is the outside of the building, space is the interior of the building. These people that built this before 1500 in Taos, New Mexico, have any of you been to the Taos Pueblo? It's an amazing place. Some places you can't visit. These are people's houses. They're made of adobe, mud brick, and they have to renew it and have to replaster it with mud. You can see some cracks there, some things growing on the top, because sometimes they put tar paper on top and then dirt blows in there. But they had their own idea of mass, and you see the ladders there. Now they have modern doors, but in the days when Coronado first saw this, and the early Spanish explorers, you had to climb up the ladder, and if you wanted to be protected from enemies, you pulled the ladder up after you, and you went through a hole in the roof into your dwelling, and you were safer that way. And these couldn't be burned. There was a little bit of wood in there, but not much. They're pretty safe, cool in the summer, warm in the winter, pretty amazing. And talk about mass, and here's the pyramids. We'll talk about those a little bit later on. And structures like this, we'll talk about this too, made of mud brick and then fired brick. I want to go to this for just a moment and make a connection here. Some of you have seen these arrows. They're in every county on the High Plains. 52 counties in the High Plains of Texas, all the way from top of the Panhandle down to the bottom of the Llano Estacado. Every county has one of these. Some are in every town. This is the one we dedicated in the park in Levelland. There are two others in Hockley County. There's one in Morton. There's one in Plainview. There's one in Lubbock. But that arrow was made by Mr. Charles Smith. He's on the right there. Charles has passed away a couple of years ago, but his grandson's still making these arrows to honor Quanah Parker and the trail that the Comanches followed here. This is the one in Morton. This is the one in Plainview being dedicated by members of the Parker family. Quanah Parker's family actually came here and did a dedication for the arrows in Hockley County. And they did the traditional Comanche blessing like they're doing here, but most of that family are Christians. They're members of the Nazarene Church. So they had the smoke, lit the sage and blew the smoke with an eagle wing in the four directions, but they did a Christian prayer also, because they felt like this should be blessed in those different ways. So Quanah Parker Trail honors this guy right here, who was half white. His mother was captured by the Comanches when she was 9 or so, and then she became the wife of one of the chiefs of the Comanches. So Quanah had blue eyes. He was a blue-eyed Indian, but he was a fierce warrior, and that horse may not look like much to you, but it could outrun the cavalry horses, because it wasn't grain-fed, and it could go for miles and miles at outrunning anything. Isn't that an amazing war bonnet? One of those war bonnets that Quanah had is in the museum at Canyon, and you should see it. It's pretty incredible. And there's one of them in the Ranching Heritage Center, but they don't always have it on display in Lubbock. Quanah straddled two worlds, though. He lived in buffalo hide lodges like this. I think that's a canvas one anyway. But he also ended up his life living in this huge two-story house that's at Cache, Oklahoma. I've been in this house. It's pretty amazing. They preserved some of the furniture that's still there. And you see these stars painted on the roof. He said, I wanted to sleep under the stars always. So even though he was in a house, a lot of times he'd go out and sleep on the porch here at this house. But so people made structures out of whatever. And we think about architecture. I want you to think about this. It is making a place to be safe and to stay out of the elements. Spanish who first came here, Coronado, They had tents like this, that were not a lot different than teepees that the Native Americans had. They found the remnants of the camp at, near Floydada, right below the Cap Rock. There was a huge hailstorm, and it, caused chaos, and the burros and the horses ran away, but they found some of the arrow points they used in their crossbows and so on. So they found remnants of the camp that was there at Floydada in 1540. So these people made their own structures, and so did these people 15,000 years ago in Ukraine. They found where they had linked mammoth tusks together in different bones and put hides over them and earth, and they had a pretty cozy house. Had plenty of things to burn for wood fire. Now here's back to Mesa Verde. Have any of you been there? Go there someday. You'll really enjoy it's in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. But these people found these natural overhangs of the rock, and then they used stone and adobe and made a pretty amazing city there. And it was easily protected from down below because they were high up, and then nobody could come in from the top there, although they had handholds they could farm up there. There's a river down below, and so it was pretty amazing until a drought period hit, and they had to move on. Your text talks about recycling buildings. This is a train station in Paris that now is a museum, the Museum d'Orsay. Been talking about Maya Lin. This is on page 307. Talking about building structures and designing something to fit a concept. Maya Lin's idea, this is in Clinton, Tennessee. This is her style for a chapel, and it says that the form of a gently curved boat, and using the Children's Defense Fund's motto, "Dear Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small." And inside the chapel, she designed that oculus, just like in the Pantheon, to shine natural light in there, in this chapel. I've not been in that chapel, but that's a pretty appropriate and interesting design. You have the ski jump designed by Zaha Hadid, who's a woman Muslim designer, which is kind of unthought of a few years ago, but she's done some amazing designs. And you see this Trans World Airlines terminal in New York City. You go to Kennedy Airport. It's like the wings of a bird or the wings of a plane there. And we'll talk about the material that's made from it in a minute. This is not in your text, but I wanted you to see this ancient Guatemalan pyramid. Some of you may have been to Guatemala and Costa Rica and different places in Central America. They took stone and built these pyramids. These pyramids were like temples, but they were also sacrificial temples. We'll talk about that a little more later. But they built these on separate platforms that were steps up. So they weren't like the pyramids in Egypt exactly. And then the text talks about this a little bit later, but I want to introduce this to you. Thinking about working with gravity to build a building. I don't know if you've ever built anything at all, a structure, but you have to think about gravity and the force of it. So early on they learned that they could make posts, and they could span that with a lintel or another piece of stone. You could do it with wood and other materials, but to build something permanent. So this is post and lintel, Stonehenge, even though we call this a megalith. But the Egyptians were building like this, and you can see the post and lintel there. Sometimes these were solid columns, sometimes they were in pieces, but you see the huge, massive stone there. They probably filled this with sand and built ramps of sand to bring these up with a lot of manpower. These are smaller pieces of stone fit together to make the columns, and then the large lintel across the top there. Here is Machu Picchu. We're going all over the world today, right? Here's in Peru, and I've had friends that have gone here. I would love to see it someday. But these people high in the Andes had a lot of stone available, a volcanic area with a lot of stone, and so they built this so they could protect themselves from their enemies. They could farm in terraces there, and it's kind of a magical place. But they did what's called dry masonry construction. There's no mortar used in these, and they're fit so well together that it would be hard to take a piece of paper and put it in between those stones. I've asked people that have been there, and they said, I tried to take my thin penknife blade and put it in there. No way. They're fit together that tightly. And they just worked with the now, you see this person looking in there. That one was originally plastered probably, but these on the right here, that's how tightly they're fit. But it's dry masonry. And even in the one on the left there, they're stacked so well in an earthquake zone, they've survived. So it's pretty amazing. Now, your text talks about parts of the column a little bit further on, and that is on page 312 for Machu Picchu. If you'll look at page 314, if you have your text, I want to show a different slide of the parts of the column. And there are three basic types of columns, or what we call orders. But first of all, let's look at the column. You have the base or the bottom. You have the shaft, that's the column itself. You have the capital at the top. So the capital, just like a capital city, right? It's the head of the government. And so you see, I'll go to a better slide here. This shows the three basic types of building, and they're still used today. The most simple, the top of the capital there, is just rounded, or sometimes it's square. We call that Doric. The other type, which is in the center there, we call it Ionic. It's like the old scrolls where they rolled up pieces of parchment or paper, and you see how it's curled up like that. We call those volutes. But that is the Ionic style, and you'll see that in different places around. And on the right is the most complicated. That's the Corinthian. Now I'll go back here, and you can see those, right? A little clearer there. The center is the Doric. The right with the curled scroll style is the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Now some of these Corinthian styles get very ornate. They're leaves. This is a campus leaf that grew in Greece, but I've seen them with clusters of grapes and all kinds of crazy things on them. Now, I'll say this. If you'd like to earn some extra credit, either go downtown in Levelland to our courthouse, or go downtown in Plainview to your courthouse, Hale County Courthouse, Hockley County Courthouse here. And they used to say Lubbock County Courthouse. They've changed all that so much. Find a building in Lubbock that shows these columns and tell me, send me a picture, email it to me today, send me a picture with a picture of that. Now don't go on the internet and find it, your picture, right? And tell me if this is Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian. You'll find all three. I know which one is here in Levelland, in Hockley County Courthouse. I know which one is the style in Hale County Courthouse in Plainview. But send me a picture and I'll give you extra credit to anybody. I used to say the first one, but I'll send it to anybody. Give you extra credit for that. And by the way, I'm working on Christina's World. I'll have that done soon. I hope by Thursday, but y'all bear with me. So the three orders, which one is shown here? Ionic, right? I had a student one time say me it's ironic. I said, I'm not sure if it's ironic or not, but it is Ionic, which is different. Here's the temple to Athena Nike, where they first started making those shoes. No, not really. We'll talk about Nike later. But that temple has that style because it shows the period of time which it was done. Which style is used here? Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian? Doric. It's the simple, right? It's just simple, rounded and squared. Now your text talks about arches and the corbelled arch. I'm not going to really ask you that, but you can see where they use stacked stone, and then they tried to make an archway that would support weight above it, and defy gravity a little bit in doing that. But this is the true arch, took a big leap when they devised the use of a keystone. And you see that wedge-shaped stone at the top there. So that took the force of gravity and directed it not only downward but outward and down to those columns that helped that support. So remember that in your notes, what a keystone is, and it's the true key to that arch working, and that keystone is that wedge-shaped stone that's there. You'll see different types of archways, and some that have huge stones at the top, but it's the idea of a load or the gravity and the weight of that material being directed outward and downward so it doesn't collapse on itself. This was built in the 1st century, the time of Christ, in France. And of course the Romans had spread out everywhere. And they were using stone, but they were also using concrete to build this bridge to span this large river. And it's still there today. You're not supposed to walk on most of it, but you can walk on parts of it. And the top was an aqueduct. Here's a picture of it from the air. Here's a picture of the aqueduct that was open, but there was a channel inside that carried water from the mountains down to the cities. And some of these aqueducts still work. You can go, if you fill your water bottle in the Vatican, in the little plaza that's inside there, you're on the Vatican tour, you see this little fountain spigot coming out. That water comes from the mountains by an aqueduct down into Rome. And I said, is it safe? And they said, it's clean, it's safe. They check it, and so it's a pretty amazing feat that they did this. This is just showing some other archways and how they're used in churches. Not sure what that blank slide was, but here's the use of concrete by the Romans. Now remember, the Romans invented concrete. They realized that they could take crushed limestone. We have caliche here, right? They could take it, they could burn it, heat it up, they could mix it with sand and gravel. Super strong material. Now an earthquake took part of the Colosseum down, but these buildings still stand, and these aqueducts. You see this if you're driving around town, right? They're pouring a foundation, they're working on streets, they're putting in concrete, but the thing that makes concrete strong today is steel rebar. That's reinforcing bar. So reinforced concrete is used all the time, and it's used in buildings all around in every town. But the Romans used concrete to create these amazing buildings. It used to be lined on the outside with beautiful white marble, and people stolen all that. It's a pretty amazing building. You walk up that street right there on the right and keep going, you'll come to the Pantheon, and you can walk in that and see this building that we looked at first. But the dome there, the idea of the dome is an archway on the 360. You remember how the keystone helped spread that weight out? Well, the dome does this, where it's an archway that's fully round. And so it takes that weight and that force and directs it outward and then downward to the supports. And when you see the Pantheon, that's exactly what's happened there. That's why it still stands today. Something that's that old. And I'm not sure why I'm losing slides here. Had a little issue earlier. We'll talk about Gothic features later, but the Gothic architectural style used these big spaces that were devised by the Romans to span these huge areas to use for the churches. And we'll talk about the pointed Gothic style. That's a pointed arch that has a pointed top to it. And there are other archways that are made of steel, other materials besides stone. Have any of you been to the Gateway Arch in St. Louis? I think they've got the heater on. I'm sorry. I can't do much about it. I can't adjust it, so I'm sorry. Maybe it'll cut off here in a minute. We had some cold weather. It changed. But if you go to St. Louis, go in this. Yes, you can go in. It's to show the gateway to westward expansion. Lewis and Clark started here and discovered this new land that we just purchased. But that riverboat there has a McDonald's on it, so you can get a good meal before you go up. But here's the cars that you go up inside. And Saarinen devised this arch out of modern materials, and you can get in these little cars. Some people are too claustrophobic, but they tilt and you ride up to the top of the archway, and then you can look out. It's a little disorienting. I've been in tall buildings before, but here, there's nothing under you. There's no building under you. And so you're leaning forward. My wife kind of had a little uneasiness about this. And you have people walk across this and you can kind of feel it move a little bit. But you can look out and you can see across the Mississippi River and out to the area around there in the city. Now, because they made these archways, they could put these huge stained glass windows in. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but here is one of the largest domes ever built. Some people say Hagia Sophia, some people say Hagia Sophia. But this dome that was built, this was a Christian church, eventually taken over by the Muslims, so you see the minarets there. So it's really a house of worship for all people, although the Turkish government, I think, recently said the Christians could no longer worship there, so they're kind of restrictive about it. But it's a World Heritage Site, and you see this giant dome and then other little domes on the side. So it's a pretty amazing use of this idea, and you have this in your text. It talks about the pendentes. I'm not going to dwell on that, but because of the archways, buildings kept getting bigger and bigger, and they put these huge stained glass windows in them, but they realized they had to support it on the sides. So these flying buttresses are those supports on the side. By the way, this is Notre Dame that was burned in the arson fire. It's being rebuilt now, will be rebuilt, better, safer. But these help support those huge walls in many churches. Chartres Cathedral was also attacked by an arsonist. But it allowed these buildings to have support from the outside to keep the walls from bowing outward and falling down. Post and beam, let me go forward a little bit here, find in the text where I am. Post and beam talks about building with wood and looking at skeleton and skin construction on page 323. I want to talk about wood first. You can build large buildings with posts and beam. This is a 7th century building that's built in Nara, Japan. That's a traditional structure, this temple, that is the post, which is like the post, but the lintels instead are a beam, which is notched and fit together. And so you can build these large structures with wood too. Wood is a renewable resource, right? Yet wood burns. So a lot of people didn't build in wood, or the buildings they built burned down. You see this all the time, right? Wood frame construction, sometimes called balloon framing, and your text has that on page 323. You have trusses like this. I was driving into Lubbock the other day, and one of the buildings, just as you go into Lubbock, before you get to the loop, they had about 100 of these trusses out there. No telling what those are worth at today's lumber prices, right? But these trusses go into help supporting the roof. And when they started building buildings like this, they could build walls and set up trusses like this and put up a building in a matter of a few days. So after World War II, they started building huge towns outside the city because people wanted to have their own home. And for a few $1,000s, they could buy a home with their own yard. And I'm not going to talk much about these, or I won't ask about them on the test, but you see where the beams are exposed sometimes on the side in these structures. You see buildings in Lubbock like this, 19th Street. Now I'll talk about page 323 as a picture, a photo of the Crystal Palace. 1,851 feet long. How long is a football field? 100 yards, that's 300 feet, right? How many football fields would fit in that? A lot, right? Yeah, a lot. And it's almost 13 stories tall. And this was built with cast iron. So they used these cast iron members. They could cast them separately. They could rivet or bolt them together and then put glass on it. And they built this so that they could have this great exposition. There were trees growing in here. They had elephants walking through it. It was an amazing thing. The Crystal Palace was a great wonder of the modern world. Sadly, it was destroyed in a fire several years ago. The Eiffel Tower, what? The whole thing was destroyed, yeah. I think there were some remnants of it, but it's sad that they weren't able to preserve it. This is the cast iron building that still exists. Gustav Eiffel had this idea, take this new material, cast iron, you can build a tower. And they were supposed to put it up and then take it down, but in a matter of weeks, they built this giant tower with just a small workforce because they riveted these pieces together. Now the bad thing about cast iron, it takes constant maintenance. And if you get to visit the Eiffel Tower, that's on your list too, right? Very romantic place to be. But you'll see workers that are sanding and maybe replacing rivets and different things because cast iron is softer than steel. If you go, my wife and I paid to walk up. You can ride the elevator, but we paid to walk up. And so those stairs you see in one of the legs there, you walk up to a certain place. There's a little restaurant up there. You can mail a postcard from the post office. So it's very romantic, great place to be. Now, steel cage construction was developed because cast iron was softer, steel was harder. Steel is another ferrous metal, but it's harder. So skyscrapers became possible because steel was stronger, the tensile strength was greater, and it was not as apt to rust or corrode, didn't take constant maintenance. So Louis Sullivan built the first skyscrapers in St. Louis and then later in New York and other cities. And then they put brick and they put all kinds of amazing things on the facade of the building. This is one of his in New York City. They put cast iron and stone and you see these line heads and all this stuff on the outside. That's the facade of the building, right? But you go in any major city in the world and you see these skyscrapers that are steel cage construction using steel beams and a steel framework. And one of the tallest buildings I heard, they're building a taller one. It's in Dubai. And it's an amazing building. Of course, the Twin Towers were steel cage construction, but no building was built to withstand planes flying into it full of fuel. So you see the tribute there. But the Freedom Tower, this is the proposed design, but the Freedom Tower that's been built was finished in 2013. That spire on it is 1,776 feet tall. That spire, that point on the tower, 1,776 feet. What does 1776 harken to?
The day it was started.
Yes, when we declared our independence, 1776. So they wanted to make it that tall. I said it's symbolic of freedom. Now, I won't finish with architecture today, so we'll finish next time, but I've got a few more minutes, so hang with me. John Roebling was a genius architect, and he said if we're carriage traffic in the day, now it's used by modern cars and trucks. I've driven over it in the taxi. If you go to New York City, you're going to go across the Brooklyn Bridge probably. So they built these stone and steel towers. They had to have an amazing engineering feat to go down into the bedrock, down below the water, and connect to the bedrock, and then come up. But he said if a piece of wire is strong, several pieces of wire twisted together are stronger. So to make a cable to hold weight, because bridges before, it wasn't possible to build a bridge like that. But steel cable construction or architecture allowed them to build these cables that were very heavy, thick cables that were multi-strand steel, and they would connect to the superstructure of this bridge and support massive weights. Yes, sir?
What happened if one of those cables breaks?
Well, you've got all these other cables that takes place of it, and they maintain it. I mean, that's a good question. If one of the cables broke, there are other cables there, but they maintain them all the time. San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, there are crews that go and check that all the time and make sure it's.
Is there like a bridge that look up like that?
There was a bridge that collapsed that was not built right, but there's some pretty amazing bridges in the world.
It was like somewhere over in the Hoover Dam.
That Puget Sound, yeah. Hoover Dam's not gonna collapse. Now, I wanna stop with this, so hang with me for just a moment. Now, the building you're looking at is made because of reinforced concrete. And the same designer designed this chapel on the left. Corbusier was his title he went by. But this chapel with these massive thick walls, this futuristic design, look how thick those walls are. That's reinforced concrete. It's a very quiet place to worship because no matter what's going on outside, those thick walls and thick ceiling of reinforced concrete made it possible. And your text has Frank Lloyd Wright in there. And this is the design for a building he did out of reinforced concrete. It talks about cantilevering and so on. But this family had this house site out in the woods. They owned this property. There was a river that ran through it. It's just a very idyllic scene. They said, I would love to have a house out here. So they hired the most famous architect in America, Frank Lloyd Wright, to design this house using the native stone and reinforced concrete. And you can see all the structure they had to have there for years to build this. But he built using native stone, these big open expanses of windows, falling water. This is not a house anymore. It's a national park. You can visit there, go through the house. But all these big porches, and you can walk downstairs, and the river's still running down under through the house. And so you can see the river, you can sit down beside it, and then go upstairs and enjoy different views from that amazing porch out there. So the waterfall comes down below the house in two places. Pretty amazing. And this is reinforced concrete too, that we looked at before. And so is the Sydney, Australia Opera House. Now we'll talk about dome architecture, shell architecture next. So I'll pick that up next time, and then we'll do craft and design and graphic design. So y'all, thanks for staying with me. And if you have any pictures of your courthouse or a building that's one of the Greek orders, send it to me. I'll give you extra credit. Y'all be safe.
Have a good day.
I will. Take care.